Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the California Society of Anesthesiologists podcast series, Vital Times. I'm Dr. Ludwig Lin, and we are going to do a follow-up to last year's podcasts. Dr. Ashley Oliver is our guest today, and she's currently a clinical instructor in the Division of Cardiothoracic Anesthesia in the Department of Anesthesiology and Perioperative Medicine at UCLA. When we spoke last year, Dr. Oliver was completing her cardiac anesthesia fellowship at UCLA. Prior to her medical career, Dr. Oliver was actually in a PhD program for film studies at UC Berkeley, having received a master's in it, then changed career directions, did a post-baccalaureate, and went into medicine. She went to medical school at Columbia, did an anesthesia residency at UCSF, including being a chief resident. And we spoke a lot last time about representation, the need to see beyond tokenism, and her goals as a physician, an educator, and communicator. And today we're going to follow up and see what stayed the same and what's changed with Dr. Oliver in the year that she's spent being faculty. So, Dr. Oliver, thank you so much for being here and taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you, talking with you.
Obviously, last year we did the initial podcast interview for Black History Month, and this time for February it's the same. But obviously, you are not just a Black physician trying to represent that. You are also a cardiac anesthesiologist. You're a critical care physician. You're trying to take care of patients and trying to do them, justice and respect. So, and you're a faculty member trying to mentor the upcoming generations. So maybe we could just start out really broadly and have you tell us how things have gone in your first year as a faculty member at UCLA, which is a great institution.
It is a great institution, and I'm happy to tell you about how things have been going for me since we last spoke. Last year, around this time in February, I had just found out I had been hired at UCLA. I still had the second half of fellowship to complete. And so I was really focused on consolidating the skills, techniques, and the tools to be a competent cardiac anesthesiologist. So I successfully completed cardiac anesthesia fellowship and joined the faculty group at UCLA in August. I have to say it's been a real pleasure and an honor to be part of the Division of Cardiothoracic Anesthesia in the Department of Anesthesiology. The amount of support that I've received has been really orders of magnitude above what I had expected. And so I feel very supported there by the department chair, but also by my colleagues and peers. And I am exceptionally rewarded by the relationships I've been able to build with my patients and usher them safely through high-risk surgeries and even smaller procedures in the cath lab. So it's been a great 6 months. I'm only 6 months in. And so, as many of our audience members know, this is kind of the neonatal stage of career in anesthesiology. But I'm feeling really rewarded by my decision to pursue my subspecialty and then my decision to stay at UCLA for my profession. Certainly the first part, and I hope many, many more years to come.
Congratulations on all of that. That's a lot. And like you said, medicine and socializing within anesthesiology, they're all just really long paths. So good for you. Since we are framing this entire conversation in the context of Black History Month, how has being a minority person in this area affected the way you do your job, or has it not really?
That's such a great question. I'm not sure how to answer it because I've only ever had my own experiences to live through. I'll say my identity certainly shapes the way that I experience the world, my hope is that it's for the better, in the sense that I do have somewhat of a complicated identity. I do identify as Black American. I'm also a Jewish American woman. I'm also a mom of young children, and I'm a spouse. And all of these, in addition to many other aspects and elements of my kind of complex identity, play a role in my connections and ability to establish relationships in the perioperative setting. I can give lots of examples. I think a really good example is that I tend to go into scenarios and new relationships assuming I don't have all the information about the other individuals in the room. I tend to assume that many people have many, many other different perspectives and lived experiences in mine. And I am often rewarded by being curious about others' perspectives. I think being, a minority, a woman, a Jew has meant that a lot of times other people haven't shared necessarily my perspectives. People haven't always necessarily been curious about my perspectives. And that's always a challenge because it's hard to establish a relationship and trust without that curiosity. So what I tend to do when I'm approaching a patient in the perioperative setting for the first time, and I see that someone's there with them, I often just start by introducing myself and immediately asking them questions. Who is this with you? And I let the patient introduce the other member of the family. Tell me about what's brought you here. What's the surgery to your understanding that you're having today? What are your biggest concerns? And I assume that I won't know, despite having done an extensive chart review, I won't know what the patient is going through. I may not know what their perspectives are. I think that's really given me a great advantage in terms of being able to establish trust in an expedient way, especially with patients that are high risk or who are at risk of having multiple complications or a non-straightforward perioperative course. These are skills and tools that we can use in probably most settings of our lives. But I try to approach almost every scenario with curiosity, assuming that whoever I'm speaking with is going to have a really different experience than mine. And by way of a different experience, really different perspective than I'll have. I tend to think of that as a good thing because I think one of the great enrichments of life is being able to talk to lots of different kinds of people and try to expand our own understanding of the various ways that a human can experience living on this planet and having this shared experience. So that's a big answer for a good question. And I hope it's helpful. It may not be this kind of standard answer about being a minority or an underrepresented in medicine individual, but I think it's a big strength that I bring to the table.
Well, I'm in awe because I kind of am speechless right now. I think that is such a great way to utilize your history as a person to really bring something to your practice as a doctor. And I was just trying to ask the usual question almost, and you gave me a much, much better answer. And I feel like that is actually a superpower that you're bringing, is to utilize your background and the context of that in a positive way when you're communicating with not just patients, but patients' families as well as the other healthcare professionals around you. And you're right, we all have very different backgrounds, different experiences. And of course, that's going to be impacting the way a conversation or a collaborative experience goes forward. And I think we could all learn from that. So that was beautiful. And I think that's something that's going to apply for everybody that's listening to this. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, there's so many questions I have following that, but maybe the easiest question for me to ask you is, how has your approach been received by the patients and their families as well as your colleagues. Are there any particular instances that stand out in your mind and your memory?
I can think of a few examples, and I'm sure that the listeners and watchers have their own similar examples of times that you approach the bedside and you begin to already tell yourself the story of the patient who's laying in the bed, and then you exhibit some curiosity, and very quickly, 30 seconds in, you understand you didn't have the full picture, and the patient shows you a side of themselves that you didn't know was there, for the better or for the more challenging. I would say similarly, I've been able to forge really strong relationships in a short order of time with the cardiac surgeons that I work with. And I'm actually quite proud of that. Our cardiac surgeons at UCLA are phenomenal. They all have quite large personalities, and it can be, you could imagine it could be intimidating to be a new graduate from a fellowship program. These attendings have watched you on your growth trajectory as a fellow, and so they certainly do remember me in my early fellowship days when certain things were more challenging. A complete echocardiography exam was challenging. Separating from cardiopulmonary bypass was challenging for me. Those things are less so now. And I think me being able to show up every morning on time with a fresh face and newly curious about how my surgeons are doing, asking about, what they've noticed, how our mutual patients have been doing. My ability to be curious about the surgeons too, I think, has put me in a good place with them so that they do trust me. They've been able to share information with me. We've built a relationship now as colleagues, whereas before I was a trainee and they were a surgeon. So I would say examples kind of from my personal life are I get text messages from the surgeons, asking how I'm doing on the weekends or checking in on me and my kids. And I think that's really powerful. I think that that goes a long way towards creating a collaborative work environment where we keep an eye on each other, we follow up with each other outside of work, we're committed to supporting one another. And that collaborative relationship certainly then takes hold in the OR in a challenging case. If the patient's not doing well and we have to figure out how to communicate, quickly and come to quick resolution so that we can move forward together.
This is just amazing because you're totally right. I think being able to build those communication channels so that it's not a forced behavior, but people are comfortable doing it. That's going to be so helpful when you are in a clinically challenging situation. So it sounds like you've done a lot of work in that and it's paid dividends. So good on you. So let's talk a little bit more about uh, you as a young faculty. I personally feel like it's a very challenging time to be starting out in medicine in general, but also in academic medicine because I think that the pressures to be productive both clinically and academically or educationally are just so much higher. If you could share with us some of the thoughts that you've had and whether you've changed your approach or your thoughts about that.
That's a great question. So, this answer is going out to all the junior attendings and all of the CA3s that are planning to launch themselves in the next 12 months or so. I would say some of the biggest lessons that I've learned in the last 6 to 8 months are it's really important to build your network of collaborators and supporters. And I actually gave this advice to one of our current fellows just yesterday. I sat her down in the Echo Lab and took out an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and started drafting out essentially a 3-legged table. So the first leg has to be the practice group that you're in. You have to feel comfortable and good and able to collaborate with the people who you come to work with every day. And so that's a really important part of early practice. I think another really important part of practice, and this is very apropos our platform today, is the professional societies. I don't think I had a very strong understanding of all the advantages that are conferred upon, I'll say anesthesiologists, because that's my specialty. But I didn't have a full appreciation of the benefits of being a member of a professional society until probably just this last year or so. I'm planning to get more involved in the CSA. I have been fairly involved in the Society of Cardiovascular Anesthesiologists, the SCA. And I think it's really important, especially as a junior person, to really, even if it feels challenging or awkward, to put yourself out there and show up to meetings and go to webinars. I think it's really important that junior anesthesiologists extend themselves in that way, in part because there's just such an opportunity for personal enrichment. Obviously, everyone talks about networking, and that's true too. But I think that these professional societies, whether it's SOAP or PEDS, I think that they really give us a unique opportunity to learn expediently from one another. And that is so the name of the game, especially early on. I like to say I'm well trained and I have good instincts, but what I lack is experience, and I won't get experience except to build it over time. So the best way that I can proxy experience is to be in close communication with experienced anesthesiologists. And that's the role right now that the professional societies are playing for me, is that they give me access to experienced anesthesiologists from a broad geographical region. And I can use these networks to my advantage by accelerating my learning that otherwise would just be kind of one day at a time. But all you need to do is get on a quick chat or on a conversation thread with a few anesthesiologists who've been doing this for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, and you'll get so many stories and lots of great advice. So that's the second leg, is to, I think, really for junior faculty members to understand that these professional societies are really such wealths of knowledge, information. And then the third piece that you mentioned for me, because I am in an academic center and I do have research interests, is to figure out what role research will play in my career. I'm still in the early stages of this, and I'm still defining even where I want to turn my research attention. But actually, research is part of what brought me into medicine. I love asking difficult questions. I love having to think through problems. And I love finding new data and making meaning of data. And I really believe that we need excellent thinkers to interpret data to its best potential so that we can then turn that around and serve our patients. And I'm very committed to being in those conversations about thinking about how we can possibly serve the most patients from the broadest backgrounds to the utmost degree. And so the jury's still out in terms of how I'll use my research leg of my three-legged table. But I would say, thinking about the next 18 months for me, it will certainly be me developing myself in these three domains. So at work, in my clinical setting, at my practice group, certainly the professional societies that I see as helping to accelerate my growth and efficacy as an anesthesiologist. And then third, participating in research communities that are committed and share my goals of bringing forth new data and new information that we can serve our patients with.
Sounds great. And best of luck doing that. It sounds like you know what you want to get out of this process. And it also sounds like you have a good idea of the potential areas that you want to do. So hey, that's great. I don't think this is necessarily what you're going to do in terms of communication, but because of your background in film studies, I would love to just pick your brain on some issues related to Black History Month. But as a non-filmmaker, I sort of equate filmmaking with being an anthropologist, that you are most likely very interested and very good at observing, human interactions and thinking about that. And that's something that I personally have tried to delve into with this podcast series over the last year. We've discussed topics like, workplace culture, how people work together or don't work together, talked about the role of empathy. Why do humans actually have this quality of empathy? One of the UCLA anthropology professors actually studies this as his professional niche, which is, again, super cool for UCLA. And again, so I don't necessarily think that this is your thing, but have you, as a student of, anthropology, noticed anything in the years that you've been in medicine?
That's a great question. Let me think about the best way to answer it. I will say that my desire to connect with other humans was a big driver in choosing medicine, in part because there is just such an amazing opportunity to show up for another person in that way. I think that's probably fairly common. You'll hear versions of that statement in a lot of medical student applications for medical school. If I hadn't gone to medical school, I might have actually gone into the rabbinate and become a rabbi. And I say that because I was speaking actually with our department chair. This was prior to me getting the job offer at UCLA. And I was meeting with him and I was asking him if he liked his job as department chair. And he said to me, that's not quite the right question, because it's not about me liking my job. It's an honor and a privilege to serve the faculty of the department. But my job is actually more similar than dissimilar to helping a community through the ups and downs of its beingness, its being a community. And he likened his job to being a little bit like a rabbi in the sense that there's lots of ways in which he's called to help work through something that's happening in the community. And he has to figure out how to do that in an effective, often novel way. And for him, he's Jewish as I am. For him, he likened that job to the way that a rabbi tends to a community. I see just even more broad similarities between that type of attentiveness to a community and my desire to be attentive to the various communities to which I belong. So that includes the community of perioperative physicians, anesthesiologists, of which I am one. That includes my group at UCLA. And I guess going back to earlier statements I made in our conversation today, I think a lot of it comes down to being willing to be curious about how other people are doing and what they're going through. I think there are a lot of ways right now in our communities at local and national levels that we've lost the ability to be curious about one another. And where I see conversations break down a lot, or people start to distrust one another or point fingers or start assuming the worst out of other people, has to do with maybe not really being so curious. And one of the words that you also just used is really lacking empathy, which is hard to do sometimes. I will admit that it can be hard for me to have empathy with all people all the time. I don't know that I'm not Mother Teresa. I don't have that ability to hold the whole spectrum of human behavior in myself with all empathy all the time. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but I do think that it does require a certain amount of dedication and rigor, and kind of the desire for me at the end of the day is to be part of and a contributor to building effective communities so that our societies can function, we can raise our children, we can create art, we can help each other heal, all those things. So I think those things are connected for me.
Yes. When you were talking just now, it made me think about something that I brought up in other conversations, and it's a concept I refer to as slow medicine. And I just feel like all of us are always in a rush, and it's not wrong. We're trying to get home, trying to spend time with our loved ones, trying to get something to eat. But it's only when we really take that pause and listen to others and think about where they come from, what could their stories be, where we actually build those bridges, right? But I don't think we do that enough. Don't you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's really hard, and we have a lot vying for our attention. We all have too many projects to do, not enough time to do it in. But I agree, slowing down, I think, is a major protective factor against starting to depersonalize others around us. It's just because there's only kind of so much you can hold at once. And so the easy thing to do is kind of rush through and not be so curious. And yeah, I completely agree.
You were talking about medical students and talking to them, and that reminded me that it's time for interviews for residency and the match, and I'm on social media, so I see all these people being ecstatic about getting interviewed, getting a spot or not getting a spot, and I think it's a really strange time for that when somebody's not from the mainstream. When one is, for example, from a non-traditional socioeconomic background, or somebody who is ethnically a minority. Uh, I feel like our conversation today is trying to not just limit ourselves to that, but do you feel like this conversation about diversity has changed in the last year, the last couple of years? I mean, also with the background of the abolition of, I'm drawing a blank, but I'm talking about the not really having a codified way to admit minority students anymore.
It's a really loaded question that you've just asked. And if you're
Yeah,
referring to the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard ruling at the Supreme Court level, there is a lot that we could probably devote a whole, not only podcast, but honestly, webinar series to unpacking. I'm not an expert, and so I can't come to these conversations from the perspective of expertise. So I'll
sure.
start by kind of making some space in that way. I see a lot of different sides to some of the concerns that people have, honestly, from all sides. Ultimately, not much has really changed about me and my priorities, which is I want to make our fields more diverse because I think there's great evidence that diverse teams help improve outcomes for patients. That's just the science. We've seen it. It's been studied. When you have a playing field that is narrowed to certain groups of people, you start to see inequity in all kinds of things, and you're not setting up systems of trust and mutual respect, and you're going to make it harder for all comers to obtain great healing. I just think that's true. That's just kind of core ethic and moral that I have. I'm dismayed, I have to say, by a lot of the caliber of the conversations that are being had around what diversity is or what it should be on social media platforms. And I don't have good evidence that social media is the place where we're going to raise the standards of our treatment to one another or humanize each other. So I just haven't seen good evidence that on social media, humans treat each other better. And that's probably one of the core reasons why I'm not on social media. And I actually don't have these conversations in social media spaces. This is a big exception for me to get on a podcast and talk with you about this, because I think that it allows us for lots of fast clicking and likes and thumbs up and thumbs down and emojis. But I don't think it gives us lots of new insight necessarily. I don't think it lets us see the complexity of one another's identities. And I don't think that it sets us up for having healthy disagreements where we can both grow together. I think we're probably in a big growth moment for diversity and what is called the DEI movement, but I actually have stopped kind of calling it the DEI movement, or I guess I wouldn't say that I'm centrally involved in it because I was always doing work for underrepresented individuals in medicine before it was called DEI, and I will probably continue to do this work because I believe in it. And I think at the end of the day, the stories still stand. I'll say very briefly, the stories that I think of when I think about the work that's important to me are stories that come from my family. So my grandmother, my father's mother, was a Black woman born in Wilmington, Delaware, and exceedingly bright. She was the top student in her graduating class in high school. She had a brother, and he was in her grade, and he was the second brightest student in the class. And so the two of them were the top two students in the class. Now, when she graduated high school, there were really no professional avenues for her. They were of limited means. They had almost no money. They lived in Wilmington, Delaware. And she wanted to go to college, but the family had only enough money to send one student to college. So they sent her brother, the second best student in the class, to college because there was an understanding that he would have a career that she probably just couldn't have. So it didn't make sense for the family to invest in her brightness and her aptitude. She ended up doing domestic work and cleaning people's homes for money, and eventually met my grandfather, who was a post office worker. And they eventually had 4 children, of whom my father was the second. But she instilled in my father and in his siblings a relentless desire to achieve academically. And that's those are things that my father did and his siblings certainly did. But it wasn't that long ago for someone who looked pretty close to me to be denied a college education just because there was no pathway after college. There was no career on the other side that was going to invest and exploit her brilliance and help turn her into a productive member of society. And so she was really relegated to cleaning people's homes. So my husband's family has many similar stories. And my husband's father grew up in a 2-bedroom home in rural Alabama with 9 other siblings to parents who hadn't even attained a high school education. And so it's really important that we think about the proximity of exclusion. These are close stories. These aren't generations and generations removed. This isn't saying that, oh, well, 400 years ago, I had an enslaved ancestor. This is really recent history. And in my lifetime, I've talked with people that have had very strong boundaries drawn around them in terms of what's been even permitted for them, for their careers, for their dreams. So that's really where I start my work. And I am not at all under the impression that I'm the only person who has family that has tried to supersede extremely austere surroundings. There are so many people like me from lots of backgrounds in lots of countries, not just the United States. I think we need to share space a little bit and be permissive of other people's heritages and pains. And I'll say probably the best example, I'm reading 2 books right now, and maybe we can put them in the show notes because they're nice companion pieces to each other. One is called Legacy by Uche Blackman. She's an Black emergency medicine physician in Brooklyn who writes really poignantly about being a Harvard-trained physician. Her mother was also a Black Harvard-trained physician, and what it's been like for her to work on the front lines of racism in medicine. And the other book that I'm reading is The Amen Effect by a Rabbi Sharon Brous here in Los Angeles, and talking a lot about the ways that we can incorporate greater perspectives of healing towards one another. Rabbi Brous is talking about kind of spirit in the spiritual realm, but I think these things are actually not that far away from the work that we do with our patients. So I think it's apropos. Dr. Rabbi Brous, I keep wanting to call her Dr. Rabbi Brous, had a really lovely companion piece to her book, The Amen Effect, which was published in the New York Times recently. And she essentially walks you through imagining you're on an ancient pilgrimage to, to kind of like a holy land where once you arrive, you walk in a clockwise circle around the grounds and you pay your respects and you have the spiritual experience. But people who are coming to this same site with trauma are actually instructed to walk counterclockwise. And so let's say you have an enriched life, you're doing well, you have the career that you love, your family is healthy, you arrive on your pilgrimage and you walk in this clockwise way, but actually counterclockwise to you, there are hundreds, thousands, more than that, people who are suffering deeply. And you're actually charged with looking them in the face and asking them, why are you hurting? What's wrong? And I think the courage to look at other people's suffering. It's very easy for me to tell you the ways that my family has overcome suffering or the suffering in my life, that we're human. There's suffering in lots of places. But I think it takes tremendous courage to have one's own suffering and look at other people and ask them about their suffering as well. We're not trained to do this in quite the quid pro quo way as physicians, because they're always asking about other people's sufferings. We're not really admitting that there have been things that have been challenging for us, but undoubtedly there have been. And I think that as I move forward doing the work that I do, trying to expand horizons for people to have difficult conversations around questions of inclusivity, how do we make groups of people not only function well, but feel connected to one another, feel responsible for one another, and ultimately grow and help each other achieve greatness together. I think if we're going to do that work, we're going to have to pull ourselves away a little bit from trying to accuse one another of various things, either not using the right word or not know. I mean, there's lots of ways in which we can be better. And I strive to be better. But ultimately, I think the goal for me is ultimately and is always, we need to build a better community of people who can not only coexist, but actually thrive together. And that's going to be really challenging. I don't have answers. It sounds like a great theory. I think in practice, it's going to be really, really hard, but that's okay. That's what we're here to do.
That was powerful. I have nothing to add. I just feel like we should all just listen to that a couple times. And you're right. And I think the overarching theme from today's conversation really actually is slow down and listen to other people and get that common thread of humanity. I feel like that's what you're talking about. And I think that's a very important sentiment for all of us to hear. And I used to smirk, I'm going to confess, when I would see those bumper stickers that said coexist. And now I'm like, you know what? That is actually pretty much true. So I was thinking about that just now when you were talking. I really thank you for sharing those stories. I'm also really glad that we got a chance to hear that. And I think, the most important thing for us to remember is that there's so many talented people when they don't even get a chance to be, at the table. It's everybody's loss.
I
But I'm not
agree.
going to talk. I'm not going to say one more thing because I don't want to detract from what you said. It was amazing. Our time's up, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. But thank you so much for taking the time. And I really would love it if we all thought about all of this more. And this is such a great way for us, the California Society of Anesthesiologists, to celebrate Black History Month. For the Vital Times podcast, I'm Ludwig Lin and Dr. Ashley Oliver. Thank you all for listening in. Take care.